Everybody who's joining the session, we're just going to give it another minute here. Some of the attendees to join. Thanks. Hi, good morning, everybody. It's just after 9:30 now. I thought we'd get going with the session this morning. Thanks very much for joining us today for this somewhat early morning session. We know your time is valuable, so we very much appreciate you taking the time out of your day. My name is James Hemmera. I'm a business leader in the site assessment line of business, and I'll be your moderator for today. We initially envisioned this event to take place in early April in person, but of course we couldn't make that happen. So here we are. So I appreciate you all joining our session. And we were motivated to do this session both as an opportunity to connect with many of our partners and clients, but in essence, we are committed to our clients to make sure they have the support and guidance to overcome the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on their businesses. As the situation changes every day, it's critical that businesses are prepared to respond to the new challenges that are faced to them. Today, you're going to get to hear from several of our experts who will share their learned experiences over the past month working on contaminated sites with COVID-19 precautions and restrictions, as well as some other useful information related to site assessments and refinancing considerations. Today, you're going to hear from three individuals, Rob Ham, who is our Health and Safety Manager for North America West, Peter Reed, who's our VP, one of our VPs in Site Assessment Remediation and is also a member of CSAP, and Carrie Dow, who is a business leader in the Site Assessment and Remediation line of business. Before we carry on too far, I want to send out a special thanks to a number of our colleagues, Rada, Lori, Carol, just to name a few, as well as IT for the support and their hard work in making this session happen. So with that, we're going to save some time at the end for some questions. I do encourage you to submit questions as we go. This platform has a Q&A functionality where you simply type in your questions in the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Type in your question and select send, and then I'll be able to organize those as we go along, and we'll make some time at the end to answer those. So jumping ahead to the next slide, please. So as with every meeting and session we have, we like to start it off with a values moment. And this is an opportunity to reflect on any number of our core values. As you can see, there's 6 of them there. These are all important to us here at Hemmera and Asenco. Today, I'm going to focus on open, honest, and collaborative. And as a result of COVID, we want to acknowledge the efforts of industry, whether it's industry associations or many of you on this call, of your efforts related to a couple of things, whether it's mental health awareness for your staff, There's great resources out there, whether it's from the Canadian Mental Health Association and others. Most organizations have employee assistance plans in the benefit packages, and now is a great time to remind our staff of those programs that are available, especially those in at-risk populations. And secondly, I have to acknowledge the collaboration across the industry. I think we all can agree. We see it happening, whether it's the construction industry, legal, consulting, and others, to ensure that the work that we do can continue in a safe manner and navigating the challenges that are presented to us. I think we can agree it's very much been an open source approach. So whether it's a focus on keeping our sector safe and resilient as possible during the current crisis, we're sharing best practices and how to execute the work. And now, looking at ways to shape the road to recovery. Next slide, please. We're going to jump into the agenda. Without giving too much away, you're going to hear from our panelists on 3 different topics today. One is related to field work and how it can be done safely. Rob's going to speak to you about how we're delivering work in a safe way. Having the engagement of employees and the effective systems needed to achieve our vision of zero harm working environment. Next, you're going to hear from Peter. He's going to talk to you about how we are executing work projects in our new world by finding a better way. And last, but certainly not least, Carrie, she's going to speak to you about what you need to know about environmental due diligence in the context of refinancing. So again, just a reminder, you can submit questions at any time. I'll compile those and we'll make time at the end to answer these. So with that, it's on to Rob. Thanks.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. Could you go to the next slide, please, Laurie? Thank you. One of the first things we needed to do in this COVID-19 environment is to understand the hazard better. We started doing this early on in March, and it was through online resources like the local health authorities that we used to figure out, how is this virus being transmitted? Is it through air? Is it through infected water droplets? Once we started getting that information, we looked into how far can these water droplets travel, and can the disease persist on surfaces for any length of time? We also understood that the severity of the symptoms range from mild to severe with elderly and those with underlying health conditions, and that they would be at greater risk. So for fieldwork to continue, once we understood the hazard, we did what we do with all our hazards, is we needed to quantify the risks. Once we have a risk matrix that we use for that, and once we could quantify the risks, we would implement controls, and we would assess the residual risk and make sure that the work would only continue if the residual risk was low. And as we developed our field procedures specific to COVID-19, we wanted to make sure that we had 4 criteria that were going to be met. First and foremost, any local health authority requirements and recommendations, we needed to have those in place. If we couldn't, the work couldn't happen. Secondly, and this is something we started doing in early March, is we started to put travel restrictions on our employees, and it was only business critical work that we wanted to continue. So again, that was a second gate it needed to pass through. Can this work meet our current travel restrictions that we have in place? When we had that successfully navigated, then we wanted to make sure our internal project team, and this included our field team members, that we got them all together and we reviewed the scope and the approach and make sure that they were okay with it. And if they had some input and recommendations, we wanted to consider those as well. And lastly, once we got on site, we wanted to make sure that everyone was committed to assessing our prevention measures daily and make sure that they were working as intended. The next slide, please. For us, very much, it was every field program was assessed on a case-by-case basis. And one of the first things we needed to do was understand what mitigation measures were in place at the work site. Now, if it was a work site that we were managing and we were hiring subcontractors, we were controlling the site, that was an easy question to answer. But if it wasn't, and there are some sites where we were working with other contractors under a prime contractor, we're doing things things like environmental monitoring. We weren't in control. And so one thing we did was we prepared correspondence for our field team that they could send to clients and site managers that basically said, hey, this has been our approach to the COVID-19 hazards. Here's the steps we want to take. We want to learn more about your approach and the steps that you're taking. Once we got that information back, we could pass that on to our field team members so they had a clear understanding in terms of what at least the site managers were intending to do on their sites. The other thing we did, and this is something that was, you see now plastered on any construction site, is we had our fit for duty questions. And, fit for duty typically can be used for drug and alcohol and things like fatigue. Now we were also putting a COVID-19 band on it, asking everyone that working on that site while we're putting on team together. And then once we get on site, we would ask these questions daily. Have you had any symptoms in the last 10 days? Have you been in close contact with someone that has had a probable diagnosis of COVID-19? And lastly, have you been quarantined or received medical attention in the last 14 days due to a concern with COVID-19? So those questions would get asked at the start of every day. We also looked at in our procedures, our travel and accommodation options, and we put together some recommendations and best practices. We looked at public versus private transportation, only having one person per vehicle. And then when it came to hotel accommodations, we were recommending that people stay in places that had a kitchenette so they could actually do their own, prepare their own meals. And we also recommended that they did their own housekeeping. So they wouldn't have housekeeping come to clean the room every day. They would actually do a little bit of their own cleaning. Certainly once we got on site, those local health authority requirements around physical distancing, hand hygiene, cleaning of frequently touched surfaces, and fit for duty, we wanted to make sure those were carried out every day. And then the last thing that we're doing, and we haven't implemented this yet, but we are looking at doing it for our very large sites. And this is our parent company, Asenco, actually builds and manages mine construction. We have a site in South America right now where we've got several thousand workers on site, and we want to look at purchasing analyzers so we can actually do pre-access testing for anyone when they have shift changes, for anyone that comes on site, so we can confirm that they are virus-free. Next slide, thank you. The last thing I want to touch on was just work refusals and acceptance of risk. Anyone in Canada, if you're working, you have the right to refuse work if you feel that the work may create an undue hazard to the health and safety of any person. So if you feel unsafe or you feel it may be endangering someone else, you have a right to refuse that work. When it comes to COVID-19, what we wanted to do and what we have done is we've taken a very, obviously a conservative approach. So anytime we had a work refusal related to COVID-19, we had a few concerns that were brought forward, we wanted to be very sensitive to these concerns. Recognizing that everyone's personal situation or home life is going to be a little bit different. And there may be situations where people want to be more risk adverse, and we should accept that. So the flip side of that is, what if we have someone that's willing to do the work and accept the responsibility, i.e., they're anxious to do the work, maybe they're not busy, they're willing to take on more risk than they would normally take on. In fact, they may say, hey, I'll take on all the risk to do this. Again, we needed to look at those situations as well to make sure that, the responsibility wasn't just being downloaded to one individual. We needed to share it across the team and across the organization. And we also needed to make sure that when these difficult decisions needed to be made, obviously competing priorities around sustaining the business, that we had multiple levels of management involved in these decisions. So people weren't making them alone, that they were feeling supported, and that we could make sure that when we had work planned, that we could do it by keeping the risks low. And with that, I will pass it on to Peter.
Thank you, Rob, for your overview. You've done a great job helping us understand the risks and getting us ready to go. My name is Peter Reed. I'm the Vice President for Site Assessment Remediation, and I'm going to speak about some of our practical experiences over the past 2 months in doing sites and dealing with COVID-19. So prior to this pandemic and the stay-at-home order, Hemmera had transitioned to many of our staff working from home, either full-time or part-time, and that's due to lifestyle choices. So prior to the stay-at-home order, we made a decision a week beforehand to move all of the staff who could work at home and stay at home. What essentially this meant was we did most of our, or all of our project management and technical work from home. So we physically distanced by staying at home, doing conference calls, doing video calls, etc. We found rapidly, or pretty quickly, that the video calls were much more effective because we're able to see how our staff were, what reactions they were having to what was being said. And our staff were going through a whole lot more stress in their life, just like everybody else. And how do we manage that stress? How do we effectively work with our staff to support them with those stressors? So it was important for us to start these calls with a check-in to understand, people are working from home, they're preoccupied with other stuff, and an understanding that it's difficult to get an 8-hour workday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. that people are going to have to come to a new normal and a new way that they do stuff. We also understood pretty quickly that our project managers' workday was increasing because they were dealing with a whole bunch of people working on their projects whose work days were altered because their kids were home and being homeschooled, and they had a whole bunch of other stuff happening. So our project managers were taking calls and getting emails from 5 in the morning for people who are getting up early to work to 10 at night for people who are working late at night. So that was happening. Now, adapting to that and understanding the changes that our project managers had and what they were doing, we also had to adapt to the field, as Rob explained earlier, that some of our remediations just couldn't stop. If you were halfway through a dig and you had exposed these high levels of contamination, if we were to leave that remediation with nothing happening to it, at a rain event, we could have a whole release to the environment. So some of our stuff had to keep going. So where that did have to keep going, how do we get the field work done? Next slide. So we went back to our basic training as environmental scientists and engineers and ecologists and chemists, and we deal with a whole bunch of different contaminants all day long, and we could deal with a whole bunch of different risks. Our primary risk is a physical risk. We're at construction sites where there's cranes operating and excavators operating and drill rigs, and there's cars going and traffic. So our primary risk is still physical risk of somebody getting hurt, and making sure we're, even though all this is happening and everybody's worried about it, you're still worried about your physical risks on the construction site. We also have the chemical risks for what we're remediating and what we're assessing. So anywhere from low ppb levels of contaminants to hazardous waste levels. So that had to be there. But now we were adding on to it a biological risk. So what do we do to prevent a biological risk? And it's, again, just your proper protective equipment and your actions to be able to keep that in place. So I went back to our basic training for when we do biological remediations, and some of them are listeria outbreaks or stachy outbreaks, and mold outbreaks. And what do we do? How do we change the way that we work in those environments? And basically our PPE and our staff went back to their training in those areas to say, well, I can't see the black mold that we're remediating, but I have to assume each person that I'm dealing with could have this virus. And I need to take the precautions to be able to deal with those people effectively. And that comes from physical distancing and treating every potential surface as being contaminated. So while we're not in full PPE that you would have for a biological remediation, we're in the PPE and the mode that you would have when you're going into the building to say this building could be contaminated with listeria, or this building could be contaminated with stachy. And putting that into your daily mindset, then people can revert back to something that they've done before, include that in what they're doing, and be able to effectively move forward with the remediation. Next slide, please. So considering this, how do we effectively do our field work? And the first thing we have to do is we have to consider that a lot of our young staff who are doing the field work are young and fit, and they might not even feel the effects of the virus if they have the virus. So they have to treat themselves as being a possible vector for the virus. So As Rob said earlier, are there any travel restrictions in place? Can I go there? Am I allowed to go there? If we do go there, then I have to make sure that I operate so that I don't spread something if I actually have it. I also need to decontaminate a whole bunch more stuff than just my work equipment. When I get a rental car, I need to take out some wipes and wipe down that rental car before I go. Before I get on a plane, I got to make sure I have a mask. If I do get on a plane and go somewhere, do I have to isolate for 14 days before I can do any field work when I get there? And do I have to isolate for 14 days when I get back? In all likelihood, it probably doesn't make sense to be able to go somewhere anymore. And if that's the case, what about the network of sub-consultants that we've had over the years to do work in different areas? Does it make sense to ask them to do some of the work that we would traditionally do because they're locally resident in those areas and they can do it without having a vector of going there and coming back? And in order to be able to do that for some of the remote work, we've used video chats and video calls on site visits. So the person who's doing the work from the local person will have a camera and they will be in contact and we'll say, well, can you look at this or can you look at that or can you do this in the initial site visits? And that way we were able to do the work from remotely and still get to look at what we need to look at. So a team of engineers who would normally fly to a site and be able to work in a remote area then goes back to one or two, well, really two people for remote areas to make sure that they're safe and they're physically distanced, but they're not a series of people coming in to be able to do it. We're also looking at expanding our drone program so we can go in and get the information we need to get quicker without going and visiting everything and touching everything in the remote areas to be able to see what's happening. Some practical aspects of some of the work we've done. Stores are closed, so it's harder for people to be able to get something to eat when they're out in the field. They need to be able to get washed up before they go. So you need to be able to have either portable wash basins or set up your own portable thing to be able to work through what's happening on the site. Before they have lunch, they need to be able to decontaminate. They have problems finding a washroom because the local Walmart will have a washroom, but it has a lineup for an hour to get in. So all of these practical things which you never ever had to consider before now has to be considered. And the final thing I want to talk about from a new normal standpoint is these webinars. We'd be meeting you at industry events, at client events, at the Stampede, but now we're not. So our new normal is doing more of these so we can still stay in contact with our clients as we go through this this pandemic and the response to it. And eventually at the end of the day, we will be able to get together at some point in time in the future and do this the way we used to do it before, maybe with some modifications, but that personal interaction still is very important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Dow now. She's going to talk about some of the phase one stuff.
All right. Thanks, Peter. I'm Carrie Dow. I'm a business leader in the site assessment and remediation group. And I just wanted to start by thanking everyone listening to this webinar for giving us a reason to take off our Hemmera hoodies and dust off our work clothes. So this part of the presentation is going to switch gears a little bit. It's really focused on the landowners and developers and other consultants that are listening. Since this pandemic started, we are seeing an uptick in requests for phase one environmental site assessments, or ESAs, to support refinancing. So what I wanted to tell you about today is that not all phase ones are created equal. I'm going to walk you through a couple of scenarios to show you what I mean. And although I'm focused on refinancing today, these same principles can and should be applied in buying and selling scenarios as well. So in other words, it's very important for environmental consultants to understand what it is you want to do with your property and to tailor the recommendations accordingly. Okay, so on the screen now, you'll notice there's a property outlined in blue. This is our subject property. It's a real property, but I've made up the data. So at first glance, this looks like a pretty nasty site. It's got a former auto wrecker on the site. and it's surrounded by former dry cleaners and a service station. These are all contaminated sites regulation, CSR, Schedule 2 uses. Schedule 2 is a list of commercial and industrial activities that are likely to cause contamination. Of note, Schedule 2 has been revised to include more activities, and this extended list was meant to be enacted in spring 2020, but the timeline's a bit up in the air at this point for obvious reasons. So what does this mean if you're trying to refinance? Let's assume for now that the site is an operating income property and you plan to keep operating it as is for the foreseeable future, or at least for the term of the financing. What does the presence of these Schedule 2 uses mean? Well, the Phase 1 conclusions should read something like this. There are areas of potential environmental concern, or APEX, identified, and these are our Schedule 2 uses. However, because there's an operating income property and there's no change in land use being contemplated, there's currently no triggers to investigate them, so no further work is required at this time. So I just wanted to clarify what I mean by triggers. If your plans included redevelopment, application for a development permit triggers a site profile. And because of the Schedule 2 use, it will end up freezing your development permit until you complete further investigation. So side note, the site profile form is also changing to a site disclosure form, but again, the timing was spring 2020, and that's now up in the air as well. So anyways, the key point that I'm trying to make is that the recommendation for further work would be different on this exact site if this was a redevelopment site in comparison to a refinance for an income property. Next slide, please. All right, so here we have a different site outlined in red. Again, it's a real site, but I made up the data. So when you go through your files for this site, you realize that you did a bunch of environmental work back in 2001 as part of a redevelopment, and you obtained a certificate of compliance, or a COC. You're concerned because that was a while ago, and you know the regulations have changed a lot since then. Also, like the last site, it's surrounded by current and former Schedule 2 uses, such as auto repairs, metal fabrication, and a printer. So what does this 19-year-old COC and surrounding Schedule 2 uses mean if you're trying to refinance? Well, here's what a tailored set of conclusions and recommendations might sound like. So the Phase 1 ESA identified that the site has a commercial COC from 2001, which remains valid for the current commercial use. If a change in land use is contemplated, the COC may require amendment. If excavation is contemplated, the historical soil data should be reviewed and compared to current standards to determine soil management requirements. Regarding the off-site Schedule 2 uses, in the event that contamination is identified at a later date, remediation would be the responsibility of these property owners, and there's currently no trigger to investigate unless a change in land use is contemplated. So no further investigation is recommended at this time. I hope these examples showcase why not all Phase 1s are created equal, and how your consultant can add value by providing tailored conclusions and recommendations based on your intended use for the property. Thanks for listening, and I'll now pass it back to James.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of the presentation content. Hope you've taken away some perspective that will help you in your business and your practice. Just doing a quick time check. We're at 10 o'clock. We're scheduled for another half an hour. There has been some questions that have come in, so thanks very much for those, everybody. And just a couple other housekeeping items. A recording of this presentation will also be posted, and we'll confirm that location in short order. But again, thanks for the questions. We'll just jump right into those. So a question has come in. Perhaps, Peter, this might be a good one for you. Has Hemmera's ability to complete contaminated sites work, including Phase 1 ESAs, differed by province? Just given your line of sight across our different regions, do you want to give that one a go?
Sure, and I can have Rob can chime in afterwards if he wants to. But our ability to complete the phase ones has not been hampered in any province in Canada. The local stay-at-home orders and requirements is different in every province. So while we have been able to do this in BC and haven't had any issues with it, I think our Ontario offices and they have been asked not to at some point in time have been asked not to be traveling out and doing these things. So Rob, I don't know if you can shed any more light into that, if whether we can do this now in Ontario. I think we're able to do it in BC. I know we're able to do it in BC, and I know we're doing work in Alberta, and I know there has been some curtailment of it in Ontario to meet the requirements of the Ministry of Health. Rob?
Yeah, a little bit, Peter. Thank you. That there has been. I mean, in Ontario, we've had to close the physical office. That was a requirement, but certainly, people working from home could continue some of this work. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're able to do all the searches. We're able to do all the digital stuff. We're able to do all the air photos, all the interpretation of that. If those areas are open and able to give us the information, and which so far they have been. In order to be able to do the site visit, you have to be allowed to be able to do it by Department of Health, and you have to be able to physically distance yourself and able to do those site visits, which we have been successful in being able to do.
Great. Thanks, Peter and Rob. There's a follow-up question that it seems relevant here along the same lines. It's around what sort of geographic reach, for example, boots on the ground, does Hemmera have to execute work regionally and across Canada?
So Hemmera can do work all the way across Canada right now through either our physical offices or our subs. So physical people in BC and throughout BC, not just in Vancouver and Victoria. We have people resident and telecommuting to work all day long from up island on Vancouver Island throughout the interior of BC throughout. In Alberta, Calgary, Edmonton, and we have people resident there. In Saskatchewan, we have a partner who we do work in Saskatchewan throughout Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Ontario, we're good throughout. Quebec, primarily in Montreal, but most of our work is primarily in Montreal. And then in Atlantic Canada through a partner throughout. We have people on the ground in Yukon and Northwest Territories, so they are able to do the work there. None of it, we have a partner who can do work in none of it. So we have local people in most areas. The only, like for example, if we had to do work in Haida Gwaii, we would have to go out and find one of our subs from before to do it because they're just not allowing people to come off the ferry or off the boats, and that's their prerogative. And it's probably a very wise thing to do for them to be able to do that. So we would have to do a little bit more work with our contacts to be able to execute that. But we haven't stopped any work unless it's non-critical work, and it can be easily postponed to a later date when it's more responsible to do the work then.
Great. Thanks, Peter. There was a question again along the same lines, health and safety perspective. Perhaps Rob, this is a good one for you. How has Hemmera's response to COVID-19 changed in the last 6 weeks or so from a health and safety perspective?
Well, certainly, starting in March, the first probably 2 or 3 weeks of March, it changed quite significantly. We were relying on information from requirements and recommendations from the local health authorities were being updated almost on a daily basis. So we really needed to, have our finger on the pulse of what was going on and what these changes were, and making sure that our staff knew about them as well. So again, that all went into what we did in mid-March was develop these COVID-19 specific field procedures that we could implement very quickly across our sites.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Rob. Moving along. Switching gears a little bit, Carrie, this might be a good one for you. You alluded to Schedule 2 uses in your presentation and the potential changes coming down from Ministry of Environment. What changes to the Schedule 2 use activity list are contemplated, and how do you see them impacting future work?
Yeah, sure, I can take that one. So Schedule 2 is going to expand quite a bit. Some of the newer things that will be captured is that comes to my mind anyways is relocated fill material. Another one is landfilling of asphalt and concrete. I know on lots of construction sites, that's a kind of a common practice to reuse old asphalt and old concrete. That's now a Schedule 2 use. And then shipping and handling of a lot of different things becomes a Schedule 2 use, whereas historically it was really just bulk production and bulk storage. Now it's also shipping and handling. So I see a lot more sites getting captured into the site profile, which will become the site disclosure process. And maybe along those lines too, even the site disclosure form, one of the big changes with that form is going to be that it has to be completed by a QEP. So I think it's going to trigger a lot more phase 1 type activities in order to complete that form to the best of your ability. So I think those are the biggest changes I see coming with the site profile and Schedule 2 use changes.
Thanks, Carrie. That exhausts the questions that have come through on the Q&A. I think just wanted to give an opportunity to the group in case there's any kind of last minute questions that anybody else wanted to ask of our panel. Panelists, if there's anything else you wanted to cover before we finish up here. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's okay. Anything else from the panelists?
I'm good. Thanks, James.
Great.
Good. Okay. The only thing, James, for me is to thank everybody who did attend. I know it was a short time frame, but we really wanted to get back to business as usual and doing these outreach events with our clients. So thank you very much for attending and stay safe and stay well.
Thanks, Peter. I echo that. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your interest and time. And don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. And with that, we'll conclude for today. Thanks, everybody.